Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the fourth of the four segments of our 2021 CCLP Legislative Preview event. We have definitely saved, last but not least, here for our housing presentation. We've got a lot packed into this next half hour for you, so glad you're here, and thanks for logging in once again. A few logistical details, first of all. As you join the webinar, please, if you wouldn't mind, put your name and organization into the chat box by way of introductions, so we know who you are and we can say hello. And then as the presentation goes along, any questions you think of, go ahead and put them into the Q&A box. So you'll find the Q&A just a couple buttons to the left of the chat box at the bottom of your screen. So if you use that Q&A box, we'll be able to keep all of the questions organized there until the end of the presentation. And then we'll get through hopefully all the questions that you have today for either of our presenters. Speaking of our presenters, we have with us today my friend and esteemed colleague, Jack Regenbogen, our senior attorney here at CCLP, and also a very special guest, Cesiah Guadarrama Trejo, Associate State Director with 9 to 5 Colorado, a tremendous community partner of ours. So we're really happy to have her with us as well. Really looking forward to what she's gonna tell us about today. And if you do miss any of this presentation, you want to watch it again, you want to share it with folks, it's being recorded right now, and then we're going to go ahead and post that on our YouTube channel within the next couple of days. So stay tuned to our social media, keep an eye out for that, and it'll be freely available for you. Previous sessions today were also recorded and will be posted. I believe a couple of them are actually already on the YouTube channel, so thanks to our communications director, Bob, for getting those up there so quickly, so you can catch up on any you may have missed. A lot of great content throughout the day, so definitely check that out when you have a chance if you didn't get to earlier. On to the next slide, please. And what we're going to cover today, some special session highlights, legislative preview of our housing priorities. We're going to talk a little bit about housing legislation. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have time at the end. We'll reserve several minutes for questions and closing thoughts. And again, please put those in the Q&A box. So with that, I'm going to turn this presentation over to Jack. Jack, take it away.
Thank you, Bruce, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jack, and I'm honored to be joined today by my colleague Cesiah from 9 to 5 Colorado. Really appreciate you joining us. I have been focused on affordable housing and eviction issues for a large part of my time at CCLP. And I've become convinced that safe and affordable housing should and could be available to everyone if the right public policies are in place. Now, housing insecurity was already a major challenge in Colorado even before this pandemic. In fact, one national study ranked Colorado 43rd among all states in terms of its renter protections. With the onset of COVID and the corresponding job loss, it's greatly exacerbated these housing challenges. And really, it's more important than ever that community members and policymakers work together on finding solutions that will keep Coloradans housed. These are incredibly challenging times for tenants. According to COVID Eviction Defense Project estimates, more than 400,000 Coloradans are currently at risk of an eviction. And according to the Census Bureau, more than 40% of adults in Colorado are behind on their rent or mortgage payments, with eviction or foreclosure in the next 2 months either very or somewhat likely. While many tenants are able to keep up with rent, they often have to rely on unstable income sources, like taking out additional credit card debt that won't be sustainable in the future. So in light of these challenges, the governor of Colorado recently took the unusual step of convening a special session of the legislature that was focused narrowly on passing emergency relief measures for Coloradans who have faced hardships due to the pandemic. One of the bills that passed during this special session was Senate Bill 002, which allocated a total of $60 million for housing relief measures. And the bulk of this funding, $54 million, was set aside as emergency rental relief for landlords and tenants. These funds are primarily distributed through two different programs. The first, Property Owner Preservation Program, or POP, is a program that landlords apply to directly on behalf of tenants. And the other, the Emergency Housing Assistance Program, or EHAP, allows tenants and homeowners to apply directly. And the best way in practice for tenants to determine if they're eligible for this type of assistance is to call 311 in Denver or 211 in other parts of the state. And they will be connected with a nonprofit that will screen them for their eligibility. Now, as part of this bill, $5 million was also set aside for grants to support people who are not eligible for other types of assistance programs. And particularly, we were very grateful and excited to see the legislature allocate this funding to help Coloradans, particularly those who may not have documentation and who are facing uniquely difficult challenges because of the limited federal resources that have been made available. Finally, in this bill, $1 million was set aside for the state's Eviction Legal Defense Fund. And this supports nonprofits that provide free legal aid to tenants facing eviction. For tenants who are currently in need of legal assistance, there are a few organizations that are available to help, including Colorado Legal Services, Colorado Poverty Law Project, 9 to 5 Colorado, and the COVID Eviction Defense Project. Now, in addition to this state legislation, the latest federal relief bill also allocated $25 billion for rental assistance nationally, of which Colorado could see close to $400 million. Not bad. The relief that was offered by these bills were surely welcomed and urgently needed. But by itself, these will not be sufficient to adequately protect the interests of renters. Additional policy interventions are still needed, both temporary COVID relief as well as permanent reforms that advocacy groups have been pursuing for years. So in the remainder of this presentation, we're going to discuss some of the potential housing bills that we might expect in 2021. And collectively, these bills will help to ensure that Coloradans are able to thrive and remain housed. With that, I would like to turn things over to Cesiah to present on one of 9 to 5's priority bills that would regulate rental late fees.
Hey everyone, thanks for the invitation. Can you hear me? Jack, I think you can. Okay, awesome. My name is Cesiah and I'm the co-associate director for 9 to 5 Colorado. I'm gonna briefly speak on, the late fee bill and why we're trying to address this. So late fees are fees that are usually charged when a tenant pays their rent late or when they fall behind on rent. And right now in Colorado, there is no regulation around these fees. There is nothing that says, they have to be reasonable. There's nothing that says that they have to be capped at a certain amount or that there needs to be a grace period before a late fee can kick in. And prior to the pandemic, we knew this was an issue as we had surveyed our members, had surveyed tenants, and really saw that it ranges. But when someone falls behind even 1 month on rent, they can end up paying hundreds and hundreds of dollars in these additional late fee charges. Right now, current law, when you don't pay your rent, you fall behind. When you get a notice to quit, which starts the eviction process, says you have to pay everything in full. So not just the missed payment of rent, but any additional charges, including these late fees. As we saw, right, with COVID, unfortunately, a lot of folks losing their jobs or losing their income fell behind on their rent or were not able to make rent payments. And before, we had a lot of questions, or people had questions of like, are these fees really that much? Like how much, and is it a problem? And we knew that it was a problem, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities found that 1 in 5 renters were behind on their rent during the pandemic, with Black and Latino renters facing the greatest hardship. So, we assume most likely that if someone fell behind on their rent, they would be responsible not just for the rent, but also for any late fees that came with that. There were some protections that were enacted in Colorado with some eviction moratoriums from Governor Polis suspending rental late fees for a couple of months, including currently but there was a gap. It wasn't for the entire duration from March to December. It was in different months. So we want to be able to address this problem. The Eviction Task Force report also unanimously supported that there should be some sort of regulation with late fees. And I'm just broadly gonna share, some of the things we'd look at. We want to make sure that there is a reasonable limit on these fees, whether it's a percentage or a dollar amount cap. We want to make sure that tenants are not just evicted for owing late fees alone, right? So when someone doesn't pay their rent, that's one thing, but when they're able to pay their rent but not the late fees, that's another thing. Right now, tenants can be evicted for owing just the late fee portion alone. We want to make sure there's transparency about these fees, and that tenants understand and know the policy of the late fee process and the late fee charges for the lease that they sign or the place that they live in. We want to make sure, right, the purpose is that these fees shouldn't be predatory, right? There shouldn't be interest that you could charge on these fees, and they should really be based on a late fee that was based on a payment, one-time payment that was late, not compiling everything together, but it should be imposed on per late payment. And what else? Those are some of the components. I mean, I'm happy to share more when we're ready, or if you're really interested about what are the specifics of what's gonna come forward. We have a lot of data and information about what other types of states have into place. Most states have some sort of cap and some sort of grace period to regulate these types of fees. And, we have done our due diligence in collecting some data from different landlord companies across the state of Colorado, not just in the Denver metro area, where we can show, for example, what the initial late fee is and the daily surcharge fee, and how that could end up being, right, up to $300 or more of late fees owed alone. And so I know I see some service providers here that maybe were even paying for those late fees as you were providing rental assistance, right? Because as you were helping people pay for their missed or late payments, you all know that you had to pay everything in full. You couldn't just pay the rent piece. Sometimes you had to pay those late fees. And so we believe that the legislature has the opportunity to address this and to make sure it's reasonable. A lot of tenants are already in a lot of debt, and these late fees can be predatory, can exacerbate the problem. And we want to make sure people are housed. We want to make sure that we can address reasonable measures for this. So happy to answer questions at the end if anything comes up.
Thank you, Cesiah, for your incredible work on this legislation. We really appreciate all that you and 9 to 5 do for the people of Colorado. So in addition to this bill on rental late fees, there are 2 other legislative efforts that CCLP is actively prioritizing. The first is a bill that would reform the eviction court process. Currently, many of Colorado's laws and court procedures unfairly disadvantage tenants in eviction court proceedings. In fact, many of the procedural rights that are fundamental to our justice system are unfortunately and conspicuously absent in Colorado eviction proceedings. As a result, many tenants are left vulnerable to displacement that otherwise could be prevented. This bill to reform the eviction court process is being championed by Senator Julie Gonzalez, Representative Serena Gonzalez-Gutierrez, and Representative Dylan Roberts, as well as organizations such as the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, COVID Eviction Defense Project, Interfaith Alliance of Colorado, Together Colorado, and Enterprise Community Partners. Now, this bill has a few different elements. Overall, it would help to instill greater fairness in the eviction court process in a few different ways. First is that it would allow tenants to be able to pay any outstanding rent at any point during the eviction court process. Currently, under law, a renter loses the right to cure or to pay back rent debt after the period of their rent demand expires. Typically, that's 10 days after they're late on rent. This means that once the eviction is filed, even if the tenant can come up with the full amount that is owed, the landlord can decline to accept. Now, some will accept payment, but others won't for a couple of reasons. Giving tenants the right to pay at any point during the eviction court process would really help to improve the effectiveness of emergency rental assistance programs, because these programs can often take a month or longer to turn around applications. And by that point, it is often too late for it to be able to help the tenant because the landlord doesn't have to accept the money. Secondly, this bill would eliminate a requirement that forces renters to pay bond to the court if they want to raise a habitability defense. In other words, currently, if a tenant's facing an eviction and they want to raise the defense that they didn't pay rent because their place was unsafe and uninhabitable, they first have to pay the court an amount that typically equals their monthly rent. In practice, this prices many renters out of being able to raise these valid defenses, since they often have to use their limited funds to address the unsafe living conditions that they're facing. So this policy currently, it undermines due process, and really it impedes access to justice, and it should be eliminated. Third, this bill would ban what are called liquidated damage clauses. And these are terms in leases that allow landlords to profit from evictions. They basically provide that if an eviction is filed, then on top of any damages that the tenant already owes, they owe an extra amount. Not only are these clauses punitive, but they also create a perverse incentive whereby landlords stand to profit more by evicting the tenant than they might by working out a repayment arrangement. Fourth, this bill would guarantee the right to a jury trial if the parties can afford one. It would also allow for the basic discovery of evidence that doesn't exist in eviction cases. Right now in Colorado, tenants do not have the right to a jury, nor do they necessarily have the right to obtain documents from their landlord that would be crucial for disputing a potential eviction. These basic procedural rights should be available in evictions, just as they are in almost every other type of legal dispute. Finally, this bill also seeks to add statutory damages when a tenant is illegally evicted. Right now, under Colorado law, it is generally illegal for a landlord to evict a tenant without a court order by changing the locks or by shutting off utilities. In practice, however, this still happens with some regularity, I think in large part because there really aren't any sufficient remedies available to help tenants when this occurs. In fact, the only recourse that is currently available is for the tenant to try to find an attorney, sue in a private action, and then even if they're successful, the tenant is still only allowed to recuperate actual economic damages. It can be really tough to quantify and monetize the losses that a tenant experienced as a result of being deprived access to their property. I have heard of one particularly heartbreaking case recently where a landlord illegally evicted a woman without a court order, and in the process, they threw away all of her belongings, including the remains of her son who had passed away. How does someone monetize that type of loss? How do they arrive at damages? Is that even possible? In light of these issues, this bill would establish a minimum amount of damages that a tenant would be entitled to receive, which would be a meaningful deterrent for illegal evictions. I also just want to point out that this is an area of policy where local governments also have the authority to act in terms of trying to properly address illegal evictions. So for anyone on this call now who may be affiliated with a local government, this is something to keep in mind. Now, collectively, these changes would help to ensure that eviction court processes afford tenants with the appropriate procedural rights and the due process that would allow them to adequately defend their housing interest. The other legislative effort that CCLP is prioritizing in partnership with Colorado Children's Campaign is focused on preserving the $600,000 in general funds that were allocated to the state's Eviction Legal Defense Fund. The Colorado General Assembly created the Eviction Legal Defense Fund back in 2019, and this is a program that provides funding to legal aid nonprofits who assist tenants facing eviction. It's statewide. we have found in our research that while landlords are represented in evictions around 90% of the time, tenants are represented by counsel in fewer than 1% of cases. In fact, access to legal aid is particularly bad in Colorado. For every 30,000 Coloradans in poverty, there is less than one legal aid attorney available to help, which ranks us among the bottom 5 states in the country in terms of access to civil justice. However, the very few tenants who are able to access legal assistance are considerably more likely to remain housed, have additional time to move and to protect their belongings, or at minimum to at least avoid an adverse eviction from going on their court record, which would impede future housing prospects. Now, the Eviction Legal Defense Fund will receive some limited funding from the new nicotine tax that was approved by Proposition EE, but it will hardly be enough to even come close to meeting the full need. And as such, we're hoping that the General Assembly will preserve the $600,000 in general funds that was allocated to the program in last year's budget. I also hope that they will continue exploring new opportunities to expand this funding. With more funding, legal aid organizations would be able to better serve the parts of the state that right now are very underrepresented, including places like Durango, Pueblo, Fort Collins, and Grand Junction. In addition to these priorities, there are some other housing-related efforts that we might expect for 2021. Among these, we might see the reintroduction of a bill. This year, it was House Bill 20-1351 that would allow local governments to pass what are called inclusionary zoning regulations. Essentially, this would allow local governments to require that developers either set aside a certain number of units as affordable or to pay an affordable housing fee in lieu as a condition for new development. And this is a bill that has been championed by the Colorado Municipal League. We may also expect to see a bill that would modify timeframes in the eviction court process to give tenants additional time to catch up on rent or to find alternative housing. In Colorado, once an eviction is ordered by the court, there's only 48 hours that they have to try to find new housing and try to take care of all their personal property before the sheriff can legally execute that eviction order. As you might expect, that directly contributes to higher rates of homelessness. Giving people just a bit more time on both ends of the process, beforehand and afterwards, would go a long way in terms of protecting housing security. Additionally, there's also discussion of a bill that would eliminate the lawful residency requirement for housing assistance. So this would help to ensure that everyone is able to access the assistance that they need, regardless of their immigration status. Next, there may also be a bill brought, which Enterprise Community Partners is developing, that would allow for expanded data collection and reporting on evictions so that we have better information to help inform our public policies. There's really a deficit in terms of what information around evictions is being reported. There's an annual report that shows filings, and most recently, the state has been updating their website, the state judicial website, to show monthly eviction filing numbers, but we don't know much about who is facing eviction demographically, what are the outcomes, how much rent is really being sought, and how much are other types of fees like late fees contributing to evictions. And so we really need the state to start collecting and reporting on some of this information so that it can better inform what policy interventions make sense. Then finally, we might also see, and I hope to see, additional COVID relief legislation offered, which would establish temporary protections for tenants who have been affected by the pandemic. And in particular, I really hope to see the legislature reestablish the moratorium on evictions that the governor let expire at the end of 2020. So in closing, it's going to be a challenging legislative session on housing issues, but also it's one that offers the promise of significant progress. We have to be honest and realistic about the situation that many Coloradans are facing. These are very difficult times for renters and for our communities. Eviction rates in Colorado, frankly, were already way too high before the pandemic, and now we're at risk of witnessing displacement on a catastrophic level. However, our situation is not hopeless. The resources exist, and there are policy solutions that can help prevent the worst from happening. If we work together, we can and we will get through this crisis. And I'm feeling optimistic that the 2021 legislative session will bring much needed relief to Coloradans who are struggling to remain housed. With that, I'd like to thank you again for your time this afternoon. And in a moment, we'd like to open the floor to any questions you might have.
Yes, thank you so much, Jack and Cesiah. That was tremendously informative and thorough presentation, as we've of course come to expect. And yeah, if you have a question, just go ahead and put it into the Q&A box now, and we'll get to it as soon as we can. So that's just the bottom of your screen, just left of the chat box. We already have one in there, so we'll start with that. But other questions you may have, go ahead and type them in there, and we will answer them in turn. So the first question, Cesiah already typed a bit of an answer, but Cesiah, if you wouldn't mind maybe just talking about that for a moment so everybody can hear that in case they're not reading the typed answer. The question was from Pat. He said, maybe I missed it, but would the late fees bill be capped at the percentage of rent, or how would the cap work?
Thank you. Yeah, so yes, there would be a percentage or a dollar amount cap on a tenant's monthly rent obligation. So most states do a percent, and that would be the option, but there is a reasonable cap.
Good, okay. The next question we have is from Paul, and it's about inclusionary zoning. He says, how do efforts address and how would they override the Telluride ruling? And maybe for folks that don't have the context, you're going to talk a little bit about what that ruling is.
So the Telluride decision, it refers to a state Supreme Court decision that essentially ruled that local governments, municipal and county governments, are preempted under state law from rent control, rent stabilization, from inclusionary zoning, from a whole host of policies that might be viewed collectively as intended to address the rate of rental increases. The way the law currently works is that some cities, they can incentivize inclusionary zoning by voluntary agreements with developers. So for example, if a developer needs a zoning change, the city can say, we'll change the zoning for you, but it's conditioned on you setting aside these many number of units as affordable or paying a fee in lieu into our affordable housing fund. But it has to be, legally speaking, a voluntary decision. Local governments cannot force, or excuse me, they cannot force developers to do this. It can be part of a voluntary agreement. This bill would change that. And it would say, at least for new housing, not necessarily previous housing or already in existence, but for new housing, it would allow local governments to require either that a certain number of units be designated as affordable, or that the developer pay a fee in lieu into an affordable housing fund. What this bill wouldn't do is it wouldn't address the state preemption on rent control. This was an effort that 9 to 5 and others like UNE helped to lead a few years ago in 2019. And that's not something that was included in this year's iteration of the bill, which was 1351. Cesiah, do you have anything else you'd like to add to that? Okay.
All right, well, I'm going to go to the next question then. Thank you for that, Jack. And I'm actually going to skip to one below that. They're both from Pat Noonan, but his second question is about any chance of another rent control bill, which I think is a good segue from what you were just talking about.
Yeah, I would say no. So like Jack just explained, right, like this will only cover the inclusionary zoning piece. In 2019, what we were trying to do was lift the ban on the 3 components: the rent control ban, the inclusionary housing, and any zoning, so that local governments could have those as tools if they wish to enact anything on any of those. But that's not going to be the case for this bill, and nothing else that I'm aware of that would like lift that ban if that's the bill you're talking about. There's like so many rent tax bills that, you know, will have to do with different things, but not on lifting the ban or enacting that way. I don't know, Jack, if there's anything else that I'm missing, maybe something with one of the other bills, but yeah.
No, I think that covers it. But to the other question from Pat about the likelihood of a legislative eviction moratorium, gosh, I hope so. We desperately need it. We need time. We need time to get the money out that I mentioned. Right now, people aren't able to get it in time. You know, it's an unusual circumstances this year. My understanding is that when the legislature convenes in January, mid-January, they only want to meet for as briefly as possible to swear in the new members, maybe pass some non-controversial procedural bills that have to get passed. But the reality is that when they pick back up again in mid-February, the damage that could be done by then will be irreversible. We're talking about thousands of families that could have faced eviction in that time alone. And so right now, what does that mean? I think we're all hoping, though not expecting, that the governor might reconsider the possibility of reinstating the executive moratorium, at least on a short-term basis, to give the legislature that additional time that they would need to consider a longer-term policy intervention. If that doesn't happen, I know that there are groups that are asking the legislature to consider this as soon as possible, including possibly in that January window when the legislature will meet. But will that happen? I think it's still TBD. And in fact, to that end, I would encourage all of you on this call who are interested in supporting this effort to reach out to your legislators and ask for their support on extending the eviction moratorium. Because the federal moratorium, the CDC order that Congress extended through the end of January, it has a lot of loopholes. It only protects tenants from evictions based on non-payment of rent if they meet certain criteria and they declare that they meet that criteria and give a sworn statement to their landlord. So in other words, landlords are still perfectly able under the federal law to evict people for other reasons. If the lease expires or if they're month to month, they can evict for no cause. If there's any type of other minor lease violation, like my dog is barking too loud, they can evict on that basis. And so there are all of these loopholes in the federal order. And that's why the governor's order here in Colorado was very essential, because it addressed some of those loopholes. And we're very worried that the spike is already happening. I heard from some partners at the COVID Eviction Defense Project that they had a record-setting historically high intake day last weekend on Sunday. They received more intake applications than they had ever received on any day in their entire history. And that's just the beginning of what's about to happen if there aren't additional policy interventions. Thank you for the question.
Oh, that's good, Jack. Very, very important that we have action on that quickly. All right, any other questions anybody wants to put in the Q&A? Not seeing any at the moment. Give you just 1 second if you have a last question. Otherwise, we will wrap up our event. All right, well, seeing none, I just want to once again thank Jack and Cesiah for all the information today and a tremendous presentation. And then I want to just speak to all of you who are watching and note the amazing work that you've heard about today. The team here that's fighting for housing security for families in Colorado that need it. The folks who are working to ensure good quality, affordable healthcare, food access and security, and fighting for sustainable incomes for all Coloradans. I mean, I think the tremendous breadth of all the work that CCLP does is really well illustrated today by the 4 sections of this event. I hope you were able to tune in for a lot of them. And let me just say that if you value the work that you saw that these folks are doing, working so hard every day, and especially now that the legislature will be ramping up, it just gets crazier and crazier. And I think our staff has been sort of fighting in crisis mode for months and months on end, and we're certainly not done yet. So if you want to support their work, stand with them. I would encourage you to support us financially if you possibly can. I know a lot of you have done that recently, and thank you for that. Colorado Gives Day, or at the end of the year, or even by purchasing a ticket when you registered for this event, you had that option. So thank you for that. But if you haven't recently, or you're looking for another way to contribute, let me highlight for you recurring monthly donations. So that's a way through our regular donation platform where you can set up to give $25, $10, $5, whatever amount you want to give on a monthly basis. And that's very helpful. It's a good way to give, a small, reasonable amount if you're like me and you don't have a ton of extra room in your budget, but you want to support an organization. It really helps a lot for the sustainability of our budget and our ability to keep our advocates out there fighting, keep these community partnerships strong. You've seen some great examples of that today, and we really appreciate your support. So if you have any questions about that, definitely contact me. Happy to help. And thanks again to all of you who have done so much to support us, and everybody for tuning in today. And one other reminder that this session was recorded, as were the previous three. So if you want to take another look at this content, share it with folks. We definitely encourage you to do that. Stay tuned to our social media and our YouTube channel. And of course, you can also sign up for our newsletter if you're not already. That definitely helps keep you in the loop about all of the work that's happening at CCLP. And with that, I'm going to conclude the event, and we will wrap up and wish you a happy new year and progress in the days, weeks, and months to come until we speak again. So thank you so much for tuning in, and have a good rest of your day.